Every time you say alcohol, you're speaking an ancient Arabic word that means spirit. But what I discovered about this hidden connection between drinking and the spiritual realm will disturb you. The ancients knew something we've forgotten, and you're close to finding out what it is. You know, there's something most people never think about when they reach for that glass of wine or bottle of beer. Something that might change everything if they knew. I spent years of my life not knowing either, walking through the world thinking alcohol was just, well, alcohol. A drink, something to unwind with, something social, something normal. But life has a way of teaching us things when we're ready to listen. And what I discovered about alcohol, about what it really represents in our lives, well, it shook me to my core. It made me question everything I thought I knew about this substance that's so woven into our culture, our celebrations, our sorrows. Have you ever wondered where the word alcohol comes from? I hadn't. Not until I found myself searching for answers during one of the darkest periods of my life. That's when I learned something that made my skin crawl and my heart race at the same time. The word alcohol comes from the Arabic term al-kohol, which means spirit. Not spirit like enthusiasm or energy, spirit like the invisible essence of something, the soul of it. Can you imagine that? Every time we say alcohol, we're literally talking about spirits. And this isn't some modern coincidence or clever marketing. This goes back centuries, back to ancient times when people understood things about the world that we've somehow forgotten. I remember the night I first learned this. I was sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, surrounded by empty bottles that had become my companions over the previous months. My marriage was falling apart. My kids barely looked at me anymore. I felt like I was drowning, and the very thing I was using to try to breathe was actually pulling me deeper underwater. That's when I started digging, started researching, started trying to understand what had happened to my life. And that's when I discovered that alcohol wasn't just affecting my body, my relationships, my work. It was affecting something much deeper, something I'd never even considered before. My spirit, my actual spirit. The ancient alchemists knew this. They weren't just mixing chemicals in their laboratories. They understood that alcohol represented something profound, something connected to the very essence of transformation. In the old Arabic traditions, alcohol was originally used to describe the finest powder of antimony, something so pure and refined that they used it around the eyes to enhance vision, to see beyond the physical world. Think about that for a moment. Something meant to enhance vision, to help you see more clearly. But somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. The substance that was supposed to bring clarity started bringing confusion. The thing meant to enhance perception began to cloud it. I've learned that in alchemy, distillation wasn't just about chemistry. It was a metaphor for spiritual transformation. Just like raw liquid gets refined and purified through distillation, the soul was supposed to go through trials and challenges to reach higher states of consciousness. The alchemists saw alcohol as representing the essence extracted from matter, the pure spirit distilled from the crude material. But here's what haunts me now, what keeps me awake some nights thinking about all those years I lost. We took this symbol of spiritual purification, this representation of the soul's journey toward enlightenment, and we turned it into an escape. We turned it into a way to avoid the very transformation it was supposed to represent. When I drink alcohol now, I understand I'm not just consuming a beverage. I'm consuming something that carries the weight of centuries, something that represents the human soul's deepest longings and highest aspirations. But I'm using it in exactly the opposite way it was meant to be used. The alchemists believed that true spiritual transformation required going through fire, through trials, through the difficult process of purification. They understood that shortcuts don't exist on the spiritual path. But alcohol promised to be exactly that, a shortcut, a way to feel transcendent without doing the work, a way to touch something beyond the ordinary without actually growing beyond the ordinary. I think about this every day now. How many of us are using alcohol as a counterfeit spiritual experience? How many of us are trying to find through a bottle what we're actually meant to find through prayer, through meditation, through genuine spiritual practice? Because that's what I was doing, though I didn't know it at the time. I was seeking transcendence. I was seeking something beyond the mundane struggles of daily life. I was seeking a connection to something bigger than myself. But instead of finding it through authentic spiritual practice, I was trying to manufacture it through a substance that ultimately disconnected me from everything I was actually seeking. The irony is devastating when you really think about it. The word alcohol literally means spirit, but consuming alcohol actually separates us from our spirit. It numbs the very part of us that's meant to connect with the divine. It dampens the inner light that's supposed to guide us through life's challenges. I used to think that alcohol helped me feel more social, more confident, more creative. I thought it was enhancing my life somehow. But now I understand that what I was experiencing wasn't enhancement, it was substitution. I was replacing authentic confidence with false bravado. I was replacing genuine creativity with loosened inhibitions. I was replacing real social connection with artificial intimacy. And all the while, my actual spirit, my real essence, was getting quieter and quieter. The voice inside me that knew right from wrong, that connected me to something greater than myself, that gave me genuine strength and courage, that voice was being muffled by the very substance whose name means spirit. In Eastern traditions, they talk about something called samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that's marked by suffering and attachment. When we use alcohol to escape pain or find temporary pleasure, we're actually reinforcing this cycle. We feel good for a few hours, then we feel worse than before, so we reach for the bottle again. It becomes an endless loop of craving and temporary satisfaction, followed by deeper dissatisfaction. I lived in that cycle for years, the temporary high followed by the crash, the momentary escape followed by deeper entrapment. The brief feeling of transcendence followed by a heavier descent into numbness. And all the while, I was calling it by a name that meant spirit, never realizing that I was systematically destroying my connection to my own spiritual essence. The most painful part of this realization was understanding that what I was seeking through alcohol was real. The desire for transcendence, for connection, for something beyond the ordinary challenges of life. These are legitimate spiritual longings. They're part of what makes us human. The tragedy is that I was trying to satisfy these holy desires through something that could never truly fulfill them. It's like being desperately thirsty and drinking salt water. The salt water might feel like it's helping for a moment, but it's actually making the thirst worse. It's creating a deeper dehydration while providing the illusion of relief. That's exactly what alcohol was doing to my spiritual thirst. The question that haunts me now, the question I wish someone had asked me years ago, is this: what are we really seeking when we reach for that drink? What are we really trying to find? Because I guarantee you, if we're honest about it, we're seeking something sacred. We're seeking something eternal. We're seeking something that can only be found through genuine spiritual practice. But here's the beautiful thing I've discovered, the thing that makes all the pain of learning this lesson worth it. The authentic spiritual experience we're seeking is real. It's available. It's more satisfying than any artificial substitute could ever be. The connection to the divine that we're trying to manufacture through alcohol, that connection is actually waiting for us in prayer, in meditation, in service to others, in genuine spiritual discipline. The peace we're seeking is real. The joy we're seeking is real. The transcendence we're seeking is real. We just have to stop looking for it in places where it can't be found. I want to tell you about something that happened to me that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember that clearly because Tuesday was always my worst day. The weekend would be over, the brief escape that alcohol provided had worn off completely, and I was facing another week of pretending everything was fine. I was sitting in my car outside my office building, dreading going inside, when I noticed something I'd never seen before. There was an old man feeding pigeons on the bench across the street. Nothing unusual about that, you might think. But there was something about the way he moved, the way he sat, the way he seemed to be completely present in that simple moment that struck me like lightning. This man radiated a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. He wasn't doing anything extraordinary, he was just being fully there, fully present, fully alive, in a way that I suddenly realized I hadn't been in so long I couldn't remember what it felt like. That's when it hit me like a physical blow. I had been living behind a veil, a thick, impenetrable veil that I had been weaving around myself drink by drink, year by year. And that veil wasn't just separating me from other people, though it was doing that too. It was separating me from something much more fundamental. It was separating me from my own soul. You see, I had always thought of alcohol as something that helped me connect with friends, connect with confidence, connect with creativity. But sitting in that car, watching that peaceful old man, I realized that alcohol had actually been doing the exact opposite. It had been disconnecting me from the very source of peace, joy, and authentic connection that I could see radiating from this stranger who was doing nothing more than feeding birds. In spiritual traditions around the world, they talk about something called the veil of illusion. It's the barrier that separates us from recognizing our true nature, from experiencing our connection to the divine, from accessing the peace and wisdom that are supposedly our birthright as spiritual beings. I always thought this was just poetic language, metaphorical talk that didn't have much practical meaning. But that morning, watching that man, I understood for the first time that the veil is real, and I had been thickening it every single time I reached for a drink. Let me explain what I mean by this. In many spiritual teachings, they say that we all have what they call a third eye, a center of spiritual perception that allows us to see beyond the physical world. In the East, they call it the pineal gland. In mystical Christianity, they talk about the inner light. In Islam, they speak of the heart's eye. Different names for the same thing. The part of us that can perceive spiritual truth, that can connect with the divine, that can see the deeper meaning behind everyday experiences. Now, I'm not asking you to believe in any particular religious doctrine. I'm just sharing what I've learned through my own painful experience. And what I've learned is that alcohol systematically clouds this inner perception. It's like putting a fog machine inside your soul. Everything becomes hazy, unclear, disconnected. I used to think that the haziness was the point. I thought the blurring of edges, the softening of sharp realities, the dimming of painful awareness was actually helping me. It felt like relief. But what I didn't understand is that when you cloud your perception of pain, you also cloud your perception of beauty. When you numb your sensitivity to suffering, you also numb your sensitivity to joy. When you block your awareness of spiritual emptiness, you also block your awareness of spiritual fullness. The man feeding the pigeons that morning was experiencing something I had forgotten existed. He was experiencing what the mystics call presence, complete, undiluted awareness of the moment he was living in. No veil between him and reality, no buffer between his soul and the world around him. No anesthesia protecting him from life, but also no barrier preventing him from truly living. I sat in that car for almost an hour, just watching him, trying to remember the last time I had felt that kind of presence. And I couldn't. I literally could not remember a single moment in recent years when I had been fully, completely, authentically present in my own life. That's when I started to understand what spiritual teachers mean when they talk about awareness, about consciousness, about being awake. They're not talking about some mystical, otherworldly experience that only special people can access. They're talking about the simple, profound experience of being fully alive in your own life. And alcohol had been stealing that from me, one drink at a time. But here's what really scared me when I started researching this deeper. I learned that every major spiritual tradition warns against intoxication, not because these traditions are trying to take away our fun or impose arbitrary rules, but because the spiritual masters who founded these traditions understood something crucial about the relationship between consciousness and spiritual growth. In Buddhism, avoiding intoxicants is one of the 5 basic precepts that every practitioner is encouraged to follow, not as punishment, but as protection. Protection of the clarity of mind that's essential for spiritual development. In Hinduism, ancient texts associate alcohol consumption with the loss of spiritual discipline and moral decay. In the mystical traditions of Islam, they distinguish between the wine of the divine, which represents spiritual ecstasy, and physical wine, which is seen as a pale imitation that actually prevents real spiritual experience. Even in Christianity, which uses wine as a symbol of divine communion, there are clear warnings about the dangers of drunkenness. The book of Proverbs says, "Wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise." It's not condemning the symbol. It's warning about the misuse of something that represents something sacred. What all these traditions understood, and what I was just beginning to glimpse that Tuesday morning, is that authentic spiritual experience requires clarity. It requires presence. It requires being fully awake to reality as it actually is, not as we wish it were or as we're afraid it might be. The spiritual path isn't about escaping from life. It's about entering more fully into life. It's about developing the courage and strength to face reality without anesthesia, to experience both joy and sorrow without numbing either one, to be present to the full spectrum of human experience, because that's where the divine can be found. But alcohol does exactly the opposite. It encourages escape, it promotes avoidance, it offers false comfort instead of real transformation. It promises peace, but delivers numbness. It claims to enhance experience, but actually diminishes it. I think about this every time I see advertisements for alcohol now. They always show people having authentic experiences, deep conversations with friends, romantic moments with loved ones, celebrations of life's achievements, creative breakthroughs, spiritual connections with nature. But the cruel irony is that alcohol actually makes all of these experiences less authentic, less deep, less meaningful. You can't have a genuinely intimate conversation when your consciousness is clouded. You can't experience true romance when your awareness is impaired. You can't genuinely celebrate achievements when you're not fully present to appreciate them. You can't have real creative breakthroughs when your mind is foggy. And you certainly can't connect with the divine when you've deliberately separated yourself from your own spiritual faculties. The advertising industry has figured out how to sell us a counterfeit version of what we're actually seeking. They've learned to associate alcohol with all the experiences that actually require sobriety to fully enjoy. It's like advertising fast food by showing images of health and vitality, or selling cigarettes by associating them with clean air and athletic performance. But the deception runs even deeper than advertising. The deception is in our own minds. We convince ourselves that we're enhancing our experiences when we're actually diminishing them. We tell ourselves we're becoming more social when we're actually becoming less authentically connected. We believe we're becoming more creative when we're actually accessing less of our genuine creative potential. I learned this the hard way through my own experience, but it's also backed up by research. Studies show that alcohol impairs not just our motor functions and decision-making abilities, but also our capacity for empathy, our ability to read social cues accurately, our access to higher-order thinking, and our capacity for genuine emotional intimacy. But what the studies can't measure, what science can't quantify, is the spiritual cost, the gradual erosion of our connection to our own inner wisdom, the slow dimming of our inner light, the progressive thickening of the veil between our conscious minds and our souls. That old man feeding the pigeons wasn't under the influence of any substance, but he was clearly experiencing something that I had been trying unsuccessfully to find in bottles for years. He had access to a source of peace and contentment that didn't depend on anything external. He was connected to something that alcohol had been disconnecting me from all along. In mystical traditions, they talk about the difference between the wine of this world and the wine of the spirit. The wine of this world is temporary, deceptive, and ultimately leaves you more empty than before. But the wine of the spirit is eternal, authentic, and leaves you more fulfilled than you ever imagined possible. I was beginning to understand that I had been settling for a cheap imitation when the real thing was available all along. I had been drinking salt water to quench a thirst that could only be satisfied by the living water of genuine spiritual experience. The question that began forming in my mind that morning, the question that would eventually change the entire direction of my life, was this: what would happen if I stopped trying to manufacture spiritual experience through alcohol and started seeking it through authentic spiritual practice? What would happen if I stopped numbing my spiritual senses and started sharpening them? What would happen if I removed the veil instead of thickening it? I didn't know it then, but that question was the beginning of the most challenging and most rewarding journey of my life, the journey back to my own soul. The weeks that followed that Tuesday morning were some of the most difficult of my life. Not because I immediately stopped drinking, I wasn't that strong yet, but because I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't unknown what I had learned. Every time I reached for a drink, I was aware of what I was really doing. I was aware that I was choosing the counterfeit over the authentic, the shadow over the substance. There's something particularly torturous about continuing to make choices that you know are harming you while being fully conscious of the harm they're causing. It's like being awake during your own surgery, feeling every cut, understanding exactly what's being damaged, but being unable to stop the procedure. I remember one evening, probably 3 weeks after the pigeon feeding incident, I was at a work happy hour. These were always challenging for me because they were the perfect storm of social obligation and readily available alcohol. Everyone expected you to drink. Not drinking was seen as antisocial, uptight, somehow defective. But that night was different because I was different. I was watching everything with new eyes. I was watching my colleagues transform before my eyes as they consumed more and more drinks. But what I was seeing wasn't the transformation that alcohol advertising promised. I wasn't seeing people becoming more confident, more creative, more connected. What I was seeing was people becoming less themselves, less present, less aware, less authentic. Their conversations were becoming more superficial, even as they convinced themselves they were having deeper connections. Their laughter was becoming more forced, even as they believed they were having more fun. Their behavior was becoming more artificial, even as they felt like they were being more natural. And then I realized something that chilled me to the bone. This is what I had been looking like to other people all these years. This disconnected, artificial, diminished version of a human being. This was how my wife had been seeing me. This was how my children had been experiencing their father. This was how I had been showing up in the world. But here's what was even more disturbing. Everyone around me was pretending not to see it. We had all agreed to participate in this collective delusion where we pretended that alcohol was enhancing our experiences when it was clearly diminishing them. We were all complicit in maintaining the illusion that this substance was bringing us together when it was actually separating each of us from our authentic selves. It reminded me of something I had read about in a psychology class years earlier. The emperor's new clothes, everyone pretending to see something beautiful when what was actually there was emptiness. Everyone afraid to speak the truth, because it would expose the lie that everyone else was also living. That night, I finally understood what spiritual teachers mean when they talk about Maya, the veil of illusion that prevents us from seeing reality clearly. We weren't just individually deceived about alcohol, we were collectively deceived. Our entire culture had bought into a massive lie about what this substance actually does to human consciousness and human connection. I started researching more deeply after that night. I wanted to understand how we had gotten so far from the truth. How had a substance whose very name means spirit become so disconnected from authentic spiritual experience? How had something that was supposed to represent the essence of transformation become an obstacle to genuine transformation? What I discovered was heartbreaking. In ancient traditions, when people used substances for spiritual purposes, it was always within a sacred context. There were rituals, preparation, intention, guidance from elders who understood both the power and the dangers of altering consciousness. The purpose was always to facilitate genuine spiritual insight, deeper connection with the divine, and integration of higher wisdom into daily life. But we had taken these powerful tools out of their sacred context and turned them into casual entertainment. We had stripped away all the wisdom, all the protection, all the intention that made these experiences potentially beneficial, and we were left with just the raw chemical effects. We were playing with fire without understanding what fire could do. It's like taking a sacred medicine and using it as a recreational drug. You might get some of the effects, but you're also guaranteed to get side effects that the original sacred use was designed to prevent. You're accessing the power without the wisdom, the experience without the integration, the altered state without the spiritual growth that was supposed to result from it. And the results were exactly what you would expect. Instead of deeper spiritual connection, we were getting spiritual disconnection. Instead of enhanced awareness, we were getting diminished consciousness. Instead of authentic transformation, we were getting temporary escape followed by deeper entrapment. But the most tragic part was that we were still seeking the original benefits. Deep down, everyone who drinks is seeking some form of transcendence, some form of liberation, some form of connection that feels larger than their ordinary experience. These are legitimate spiritual longings. These desires are not wrong, but we were trying to satisfy sacred hungers with spiritual junk food. I think about this whenever I see someone struggling with drinking. They're not weak. They're not defective. They're not lacking in willpower or moral character. They're spiritual beings having a very human experience of seeking something sacred through means that cannot deliver what they're actually seeking. It's like being desperately hungry and trying to satisfy that hunger by looking at pictures of food. You might get some temporary psychological satisfaction, but your body is still starving. That's what we're doing spiritually when we try to satisfy our longing for authentic transcendence through alcohol. The liberation that alcohol promises is completely real. The desire for freedom from the limitations of ordinary consciousness, the wish to transcend the narrow boundaries of everyday awareness, the longing to experience something larger than our usual sense of self. These are natural, healthy, spiritual impulses. The problem isn't with the desire. The problem is with trying to fulfill the desire through means that actually increase our bondage rather than decreasing it. True spiritual liberation comes through practices that expand consciousness rather than contracting it. Meditation, prayer, service to others, creative expression, time in nature, deep study of wisdom traditions. These practices don't just temporarily alter our state of consciousness, they permanently expand our capacity for awareness, compassion, wisdom, and authentic joy. But alcohol does the opposite. It temporarily alters consciousness in a way that feels like expansion, but it actually contracts our awareness. It feels like liberation, but it actually creates new forms of bondage. It promises transcendence, but it keeps us trapped in cycles of craving and temporary satisfaction. I remember reading about a study that compared the brain scans of people during meditation with the brain scans of people under the influence of alcohol. The differences were stark and revealing. During meditation, areas of the brain associated with awareness, compassion, and higher-order thinking showed increased activity. During alcohol consumption, these same areas showed decreased activity. In other words, meditation and alcohol were doing exactly opposite things to consciousness. Meditation was enhancing the very capacities that alcohol was diminishing. One was leading toward greater spiritual development. The other was leading away from it. This helped me understand why every authentic spiritual tradition emphasizes practices that increase awareness rather than decrease it. The spiritual path isn't about escaping from consciousness. It's about developing more consciousness. It's not about avoiding reality. It's about seeing reality more clearly. It's not about numbing our sensitivity. It's about refining our sensitivity until we can perceive subtleties that are invisible to the ordinary mind. But our culture has it completely backwards. We're encouraged to seek transcendence through substances that actually prevent transcendence. We're told that liberation can be found in bottles when real liberation can only be found through disciplined spiritual practice. We're promised that happiness can be purchased when genuine happiness can only be cultivated through inner work. The false liberation that alcohol offers is like a mirage in the desert. From a distance, it looks like exactly what you're dying of thirst for. But the closer you get, the more obvious it becomes that there's no water there, and if you keep chasing the mirage, you'll die of thirst in the middle of an oasis that was there all along. That oasis is the authentic spiritual experience that we're all seeking, the peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, the joy that doesn't require anything outside ourselves to maintain, the connection to something greater than ourselves that makes all our problems feel manageable and all our experiences feel meaningful. But we have to stop chasing mirages to find the oasis. We have to stop seeking false liberation in order to discover true freedom. We have to stop trying to find the sacred in the profane in order to recognize that the sacred was available to us all along. This realization was beginning to change everything about how I understood my relationship with alcohol. I was starting to see that every time I drank, I wasn't just consuming a beverage. I was making a choice between two completely different paths. The path of authentic spiritual development and the path of spiritual substitution. The path of real growth and the path of artificial satisfaction. The path of genuine liberation and the path of increased bondage disguised as freedom. The question was becoming clearer every day. Which path did I want to walk? There's a moment in every spiritual journey when you realize that what you thought was the problem is actually just a symptom. What you thought was the addiction is actually just the misguided attempt to solve a much deeper issue. For me, that moment came on a quiet Sunday morning, about 2 months after my awakening began. I was sitting in my living room, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight stream through the windows in a way that seemed almost alive. My family was still asleep, and for the first time in years, I was experiencing something I had almost forgotten existed: genuine contentment. Not the artificial high of intoxication, not the relief of numbing pain, but simple, peaceful satisfaction with being exactly where I was, exactly as I was. And that's when it hit me like a revelation that changed everything. I wasn't addicted to alcohol. I was addicted to the search for transcendence. I wasn't dependent on a substance. I was dependent on the feeling of touching something greater than my ordinary experience of life. I wasn't craving a drink. I was craving a connection to the sacred. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant that what I was seeking was real, legitimate, and ultimately available. Terrifying because it meant that everything I thought I knew about my problem was wrong. I wasn't dealing with a simple matter of willpower or self-control. I was dealing with a fundamental spiritual crisis. You see, Every human being has what I can only describe as a sacred thirst. It's a longing for something beyond the material world, something that gives life meaning and purpose, something that connects us to the eternal. This thirst is not a weakness or a flaw in our design. It's actually the most beautiful and important part of being human. It's what drives us to create art, to seek truth, to love deeply, to serve others, to search for God. But modern culture has lost its understanding of this sacred thirst. We've forgotten that it exists, forgotten how to recognize it, forgotten how to satisfy it in healthy ways. So when it arises in us, as it inevitably does in every human heart, we don't know what we're experiencing. We just know that we're longing for something, seeking something, needing something that our ordinary life isn't providing. And that's when we become vulnerable to substitutes. Alcohol promises to quench this sacred thirst. It promises transcendence, connection, meaning, the feeling of touching something larger than ourselves. And for a few hours, it seems to deliver on that promise. We feel expanded, connected, free from the limitations of our ordinary consciousness. But it's a cruel deception. Alcohol doesn't actually quench the sacred thirst. It just temporarily numbs our awareness of it. It's like giving a starving person a picture of food. For a moment, they might feel psychologically satisfied, but their body is still dying of hunger. When the psychological effect wears off, they're even hungrier than before. That's exactly what happens with the spiritual effects of alcohol. When the temporary feeling of transcendence wears off, we're left with an even deeper sense of spiritual emptiness. We're left craving the authentic experience even more desperately than before. So we drink again, hoping to recapture that fleeting moment of connection to something sacred. But each time we choose the substitute instead of the real thing, we make it harder to recognize and access the authentic experience. We develop a spiritual tolerance, just like we develop a physical tolerance. We need more and more of the artificial experience to feel anything at all, while becoming less and less sensitive to the genuine spiritual experiences that are available to us all the time. This is why simply stopping drinking isn't enough. If you just remove the substitute without addressing the underlying sacred thirst, you're left with an unbearable spiritual hunger and no apparent way to satisfy it. You're left facing the full intensity of your longing for transcendence without any means of fulfilling it. That's a recipe for relapse or for replacing one substitute with another. The real solution isn't to eliminate the thirst. The thirst is sacred, necessary, and beautiful. The solution is to learn how to satisfy it authentically, to develop spiritual practices that actually deliver what alcohol only promises. To cultivate genuine connections to the divine that don't leave us emptier than before. I started to understand this through my own experience of experimenting with meditation. I had always thought meditation was something for monks and mystics, people who had time to sit around contemplating their navels while the rest of us dealt with real life. But I was desperate enough to try anything, and I had read enough about the relationship between consciousness and spiritual development to suspect that meditation might offer what I was really seeking. The first few times I tried to meditate, it was torture. My mind was so accustomed to the constant stimulation and distraction of modern life that sitting still for even 5 minutes felt impossible. My thoughts raced, my body fidgeted, and I felt like I was going crazy with boredom and restlessness, but something kept drawing me back to it. Maybe it was the memory of that peaceful old man feeding the pigeons. Maybe it was the growing awareness that everything else I had tried had failed. Maybe it was simple desperation, but I kept trying, and gradually something began to shift. The first time I experienced what I can only call a genuine meditative state, I understood immediately why every spiritual tradition emphasizes this practice. It was like discovering a hidden room in a house I had lived in my entire life. A room filled with peace, clarity, and a sense of connection to something infinitely larger than myself. But here's what was so remarkable about this experience. It was everything that alcohol had promised, but never delivered. It was transcendence without intoxication, connection without confusion, expansion without escape, peace without numbness, joy without artificial stimulation. And unlike the temporary effects of alcohol, the benefits of meditation seemed to accumulate over time. Each session made the next one deeper. Each experience of genuine inner peace made it easier to access that peace in daily life. Each moment of authentic transcendence made me more sensitive to the sacred dimensions of ordinary experience. I was discovering what spiritual teachers have been trying to tell people for thousands of years. The connection to the divine that we're all seeking is not only real and available, it's our natural birthright as spiritual beings. We don't need to manufacture it through substances or techniques or experiences. We just need to remove the obstacles that are preventing us from recognizing what's already there. But alcohol is one of the biggest obstacles. It's like trying to see stars while looking through a thick fog. The stars are there, bright and beautiful and numerous, but the fog makes it impossible to see them clearly. Remove the fog, and suddenly the night sky is revealed in all its glory. That's what was happening to my spiritual perception as I began to reduce my drinking and increase my meditation practice. I was beginning to see spiritual realities that had been there all along, but had been obscured by the fog of artificial intoxication. I was beginning to experience the authentic transcendence that I had been seeking through alcohol, but had never been able to find there. Prayer became more meaningful. Time in nature became more profound. Conversations with loved ones became more intimate. Creative activities became more inspired. Even mundane tasks became opportunities for what some traditions call mindfulness or presence. I was discovering that the sacred isn't separate from ordinary life. It's woven into every moment, every breath, every interaction. But you have to have clear spiritual perception to recognize it. You have to have unclouded consciousness to experience it. You have to have an unimpaired connection to your own inner wisdom to access it. Alcohol had been systematically destroying my capacity for these experiences while promising to enhance them. It had been like a thief that steals your money while promising to make you rich. The more I trusted it to deliver what I was seeking, the less capable I became of finding what I was actually looking for. But now I was beginning to understand that the sacred thirst that had driven me to alcohol in the first place was actually the most trustworthy guide I could have for finding authentic spiritual experience. Instead of seeing this thirst as a problem to be solved or a weakness to be overcome, I was learning to see it as a compass pointing toward the most important dimensions of human existence. The question was no longer how to eliminate this longing for transcendence. The question was how to follow it toward its authentic fulfillment, how to let this sacred thirst lead me to the living water that could actually satisfy it. And that's when I realized that my relationship with alcohol had been backwards from the very beginning. I had been trying to use alcohol to satisfy my spiritual longings, but what I needed to do was use my spiritual longings to free myself from alcohol. As my understanding deepened, I found myself drawn to the writings of spiritual teachers who had grappled with these same questions centuries before I was even born. It was both humbling and comforting to discover that the struggle I was experiencing wasn't unique to me or to our modern era. People have been wrestling with the relationship between spiritual longing and artificial substitutes for as long as humans have walked the earth. One of the first teachers whose words really pierced through my confusion was a 13th century Persian poet named Rumi. I had heard his name before, seen his quotes on social media, but I had never really understood what he was talking about. Now, reading his words with the eyes of someone desperately seeking authentic spiritual experience, his poetry came alive in a way that took my breath away. Rumi wrote about two kinds of wine. The wine of this world, which he described as a pale imitation, and the wine of divine love, which he said was the only intoxication worth seeking. He didn't condemn the desire for transcendence. He celebrated it. But he insisted that true spiritual intoxication could only come through love of the divine, through surrender to something greater than oneself, through practices that opened the heart rather than clouding the mind. Reading Rumi, I realized that I wasn't the first person to confuse physical wine with spiritual wine. This confusion has been going on for centuries. People have always been tempted to seek through substances what can only be found through authentic spiritual practice. But the mystics who had actually tasted the wine of divine love unanimously agreed that there was no comparison between the artificial and the authentic. Rumi described the wine of divine love as an intoxication that never wore off, that never left you with a hangover, that never created addiction or dependency. He wrote about a kind of spiritual ecstasy that elevated consciousness rather than diminishing it, that brought clarity rather than confusion, that connected you more deeply to others rather than isolating you from them. This resonated with something deep in my soul because I was beginning to taste this divine wine myself through meditation and prayer. I was beginning to experience states of consciousness that were more satisfying than any chemical intoxication I had ever known. States of peace so profound that they made all my previous attempts to find peace through alcohol seem like trying to quench thirst with salt water. But Rumi wasn't the only teacher who spoke to my condition. I discovered a 20th century spiritual teacher named Osho who had written extensively about the relationship between meditation and intoxication. Osho described alcohol as anesthesia that people use to avoid confronting their pain, their emptiness, their spiritual hunger. According to Osho, the problem with using anesthesia to deal with spiritual pain is that it prevents the very confrontation that's necessary for spiritual growth. Pain, he argued, is often a signal that something in our lives needs to change. Spiritual emptiness is often a call to seek authentic fulfillment. Emotional discomfort is often an invitation to develop greater emotional maturity and resilience. But when we numb these signals with alcohol, we miss the opportunity for growth that they represent. We remain stuck in patterns that aren't serving us because we've anesthetized ourselves to the feedback that would motivate us to change. We stay spiritually immature because we've found a way to avoid the discomfort that would force us to develop spiritually. This hit me like a lightning bolt of recognition. How many years had I spent medicating symptoms instead of addressing root causes? How many opportunities for growth had I missed because I had chosen temporary relief over permanent transformation? How many times had my soul been trying to tell me something important, only to have its voice drowned out by artificial intoxication? Osho emphasized meditation and presence as alternatives to intoxication. He taught that when we learn to be fully present to our experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable, we develop the spiritual muscles necessary for authentic happiness. We learn to find peace in the midst of chaos, joy in the midst of challenges, and connection in the midst of solitude. But the teacher whose words affected me most deeply was a man named Paramhansa Yogananda. Yogananda had spent his life studying the relationship between consciousness and spiritual development, and he had very specific things to say about alcohol's effects on spiritual progress. According to Yogananda, alcohol doesn't just affect the body and mind, it affects the subtle energy systems that connect us to higher states of consciousness. He described these energy systems as being like delicate musical instruments that need to be finely tuned to receive spiritual guidance and experience genuine transcendence. Alcohol, he said, was like taking a hammer to these delicate instruments. It disrupted the harmony between body, mind, and spirit that's necessary for authentic spiritual experience. It interfered with the subtle perceptual abilities that allow us to recognize divine guidance in our daily lives. It created static in the communication channels between our conscious minds and our souls. This explains something I had been noticing in my own experience. The more I drank, the less sensitive I became to what some people call intuition or inner guidance. The more I used alcohol to make decisions or cope with stress, the less I trusted my own inner wisdom. The more I relied on artificial intoxication for inspiration or creativity, the less access I had to genuine inspiration and authentic creativity. But Yogananda didn't just describe the problem, he offered a solution. He taught specific meditation techniques designed to restore the harmony between body, mind, and spirit. He explained how to develop the kind of inner clarity that makes external intoxicants unnecessary. He showed how to access states of consciousness so satisfying that the desire for artificial alternatives naturally falls away. Following his guidance, I began to experience what he called divine communion. Moments of such profound connection to something greater than myself that every artificial substitute I had ever tried seemed laughable by comparison. It was like discovering that I had been trying to illuminate my house with candles when electric power had been available all along. But here's what was so remarkable about learning from these teachers. None of them asked me to simply stop drinking through willpower or self-discipline. None of them suggested that I white-knuckle my way through withdrawal and then spend the rest of my life fighting cravings. Instead, they showed me how to develop such a rich and satisfying spiritual life that alcohol would naturally become unnecessary. They taught me that the most effective way to eliminate a lesser pleasure is to discover a greater one. The most reliable way to break free from artificial satisfaction is to develop access to authentic fulfillment. The surest way to overcome dependency on external substances is to cultivate such a deep connection to internal sources of peace and joy that external substances lose their appeal. This approach made perfect sense to me because it addressed the root cause rather than just the symptoms. Instead of trying to force myself to stop seeking transcendence, it taught me how to find transcendence through means that actually delivered what they promised. Instead of trying to eliminate my sacred thirst, it showed me how to satisfy that thirst authentically. The process wasn't easy. Learning to meditate consistently took discipline. Developing genuine spiritual practices required patience. Cultivating authentic inner peace demanded facing aspects of myself and my life that I had been avoiding for years. But unlike the artificial satisfaction of alcohol, every step forward in this process brought lasting benefits that accumulated over time. Each day of authentic spiritual practice made the next day easier. Each moment of genuine transcendence made me more sensitive to the sacred dimensions of ordinary life. Each experience of true inner peace made artificial peace seem less appealing. I was discovering what these teachers had been trying to tell people for centuries. The peace we're seeking is real. The joy we're longing for is available. The transcendence we're craving is our birthright as spiritual beings. We just have to stop looking for it in places where it can't be found and start seeking it through practices that actually work. The wine of divine love that Rumi wrote about wasn't just beautiful poetry. It was a practical description of an actual experience that becomes available when we approach the spiritual path with sincerity and dedication. The freedom from intoxication that Osho described wasn't just idealistic philosophy. It was a natural result of developing such a satisfying relationship with reality that artificial alternatives become unnecessary. The divine communion that Yogananda taught wasn't just mystical theory. It was a tangible experience of connection to something infinitely greater than our ordinary sense of self, something that makes every substitute seem pale and unsatisfying by comparison. I was beginning to understand that I hadn't been seeking alcohol at all. I had been seeking God. I just didn't know it. There's a moment in every transformation when you realize that you're not just changing a habit, you're changing your entire identity. For me, that moment came on a Thursday evening in November, about 4 months into what I was beginning to think of as my spiritual awakening. I was standing in the wine aisle of the grocery store, a place I had visited hundreds of times before without giving it much thought. But that evening, it felt like I was seeing it for the first time. Row upon row of bottles, each one promising something it couldn't deliver. Each one wearing a beautiful label that hid its true nature. Each one representing the same false promise that had kept me trapped for so many years. But what struck me most wasn't the bottles themselves. It was the people around me. I watched a well-dressed businessman carefully selecting an expensive bottle of whiskey, and I could see in his eyes the same desperate hope I had carried for years. The hope that this bottle would provide something that life itself hadn't been providing. The hope that alcohol would fill a void that nothing else seemed able to touch. I watched a young mother grabbing a bottle of wine while juggling a crying baby and talking on her phone, and I recognized the exhaustion, the overwhelm, the desperate need for something to take the edge off. I watched an elderly man slowly examining labels with shaking hands, and I saw the loneliness, the disappointment with how life had turned out, the need for something to make the days more bearable. And my heart broke for all of them, because I understood exactly what they were seeking and exactly why they would never find it in those bottles. They were all spiritual beings having a human experience, and they were all trying to satisfy spiritual needs through material means. They were all seeking transcendence, connection, peace, joy, meaning, and they had all been told that alcohol could provide these things. But I knew now what they didn't know yet. I knew that what they were seeking was real and available, but not in the way they were looking for it. I knew that the peace they craved existed, but it was an inner peace that no external substance could provide. I knew that the joy they longed for was their birthright as children of the divine, but it could only be accessed through authentic spiritual practice. Standing in that wine aisle, I realized that I was witnessing a tragedy of epic proportions. Millions of people, maybe billions, spending their lives seeking the sacred through means that actually separate them from the sacred. Countless souls trying to fill a God-shaped hole with everything except God. Endless searching for the infinite through the finite. But I also realized that I was no longer one of them. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding, and that shift had changed everything about how I related to alcohol. I no longer saw it as a solution to any problem I had. I no longer believed it could provide anything I actually needed. I no longer wanted what it was offering because I had discovered something infinitely better. This wasn't willpower or self-discipline keeping me away from alcohol. This was genuine lack of interest. It was like being offered a black and white television when you've grown accustomed to high-definition color. It was like being invited to eat fast food when you've developed a taste for gourmet cuisine. It was like being asked to settle for a candle when you have access to electric light. The spiritual practices I had been developing weren't just alternative ways to cope with life. They were superior ways to experience life. Meditation wasn't just a substitute for alcohol, it was an upgrade to a completely different level of consciousness. Prayer wasn't just another way to feel better, it was a direct connection to the source of all genuine well-being. But this transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been a period of what I can only describe as spiritual withdrawal. Just as my body had become accustomed to artificial stimulation and had to readjust to natural rhythms, my soul had become accustomed to artificial transcendence and had to remember how to access authentic spiritual experience. During those first few weeks of reducing my alcohol consumption and increasing my spiritual practice, I felt like I was living between two worlds. The old world, where alcohol provided temporary relief from life's challenges, and a new world where spiritual practice provided lasting transformation of my relationship to those challenges. The old world was familiar, but ultimately unsatisfying. The new world was mysterious but deeply fulfilling. The transition between them was uncomfortable but necessary. I was learning that genuine spiritual growth always involves a period of discomfort as we release what no longer serves us and embrace what does. But what made this transition bearable, even exciting, was the growing recognition that I was trading up. I wasn't sacrificing anything real. I was releasing a counterfeit in order to receive the authentic. I wasn't giving up pleasure. I was exchanging temporary pleasure for permanent joy. I wasn't losing freedom. I was gaining the only freedom that actually matters, which is freedom from the compulsions and addictions that keep us trapped in patterns that don't serve our highest good. The more deeply I engaged with authentic spiritual practice, the more obvious it became that alcohol had never given me anything I actually wanted. It had given me the illusion of confidence, but real confidence comes from knowing who you are and trusting in your connection to something greater than yourself. It had given me the feeling of social connection, but genuine intimacy requires presence, vulnerability, and authenticity, all of which alcohol actually prevents. It had given me temporary escape from problems, but real peace comes from developing the inner resources to face problems with grace and wisdom. It had given me the sensation of creativity, but true creativity flows from a clear mind and an open heart, both of which alcohol obscures. Every benefit that alcohol had seemed to provide was actually available through spiritual practice, but in a form that was more reliable, more satisfying, and more sustainable. The confidence that comes from spiritual development doesn't wear off after a few hours. The social connection that comes from authentic presence doesn't lead to regret and shame. The peace that comes from inner development doesn't require constant maintenance through external substances. I was discovering what spiritual teachers call the Great Exchange. The willingness to release what seems good in order to receive what is actually good. The courage to let go of what feels safe in order to embrace what is truly secure. The wisdom to abandon what appears to work in order to discover what actually works. This process required a complete reorientation of my understanding of what constitutes a good life. In our culture, we're taught that pleasure is the highest goal, that comfort is the ultimate value, that feeling good in the moment is more important than being good in the long term. But spiritual development taught me that these cultural values are not only wrong, they're backwards. The spiritual path teaches that meaning is more important than pleasure, that growth is more valuable than comfort, that being good is more fulfilling than feeling good. These aren't moralistic rules imposed from the outside. They're discoveries about what actually creates lasting happiness and authentic fulfillment. When you live according to these deeper values, alcohol naturally becomes less appealing because it represents everything that the spiritual path transcends. It represents the pursuit of pleasure over meaning, comfort over growth, feeling good over being good. It represents the old way of living that you've outgrown. But this doesn't make you superior to people who are still trapped in the old patterns. If anything, it makes you more compassionate because you understand exactly what they're seeking and exactly why they're looking for it in the wrong places. You remember what it was like to be lost in the maze of artificial satisfactions. You remember the desperation, the confusion, the sincere but misguided attempts to find happiness through means that couldn't deliver it. Standing in that wine aisle, looking at all those people seeking something sacred through something profane, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the grace that had led me out of that maze. I hadn't found my way out through my own wisdom or strength. I had been guided by teachers who had walked this path before me, supported by spiritual practices that had been tested by millions of people over thousands of years, and sustained by a power greater than myself that I was only beginning to understand. The great exchange wasn't something I had accomplished through willpower. It was something that had happened to me as a natural result of opening my heart to authentic spiritual experience. The more I tasted the wine of divine love, the less appealing the wine of this world became. The more I experienced genuine transcendence, the less interest I had in artificial substitutes. I was learning that spiritual transformation isn't about forcing yourself to be different. It's about becoming so satisfied with authentic spiritual experience that artificial alternatives lose their appeal naturally and effortlessly. What I wasn't prepared for was how dramatically my transformation would affect the people around me. When you change your relationship with something as fundamental as consciousness itself, it sends ripples through every aspect of your life. Those ripples touch everyone who knows you, and not everyone is ready for the waves. My wife noticed the changes first, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was different. I was more present when we talked, more patient with the children, more engaged with family activities. But I was also different in ways that made her uncomfortable. I was less interested in the social activities that had defined our life together. I was less willing to participate in the cultural rituals that revolved around drinking. At first, she thought I was going through some kind of midlife crisis. She worried that I was becoming one of those people who get overly religious or obsessed with self-improvement. She missed the version of me that would relax with a glass of wine in the evening, the husband who would share a bottle during romantic dinners, the party companion who helped make social gatherings more fun. What she didn't understand, at least not initially, was that I wasn't becoming less fun or less social. I was becoming more authentically myself. The person she had fallen in love with years earlier, before alcohol had gradually dulled my natural personality, was re-emerging. But it had been so long since either of us had seen that person that he felt like a stranger. This created a strange dynamic in our marriage. The changes that were making me happier and more fulfilled were making her anxious and uncertain. The spiritual practices that were bringing me peace were foreign to her worldview. The clarity that was illuminating my understanding of life was highlighting problems in our relationship that we had been medicating rather than addressing. I remember one particular evening when this tension came to a head. We had been invited to a dinner party with friends, the kind of gathering where wine flowed freely and conversation grew louder and more animated as the evening progressed. In the past, I would have participated fully in the drinking, probably becoming one of the loudest and most animated guests myself. But that night, I chose to remain sober, and from that vantage point, I saw the gathering through completely different eyes. I watched people I cared about gradually lose themselves as the evening progressed. I saw conversations become less meaningful as they became more intoxicated. I witnessed the artificial intimacy that alcohol creates, the false sense of connection that feels real in the moment but leaves everyone feeling more isolated the next day. My wife was embarrassed by my sobriety. She felt like my choice not to drink was somehow judging everyone else's choice to drink. She worried that our friends would think we were going through marital problems or that I was developing some kind of holier-than-thou attitude. She wanted me to just have one drink, just to be normal, just to fit in. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't unknown what I had learned. I couldn't go back to participating in a cultural ritual that I now understood was actually preventing the very things it promised to provide. I couldn't pretend that alcohol was enhancing social connection when I could clearly see that it was diminishing authentic communication and genuine intimacy. This wasn't judgment of other people, it was simply recognition of reality. People weren't becoming more themselves when they drank. They were becoming less themselves. They weren't connecting more deeply. They were creating the illusion of connection while actually becoming more isolated in their own artificially altered states of consciousness. But explaining this to my wife felt impossible. How do you share a spiritual insight with someone who doesn't share your spiritual framework? How do you describe seeing through an illusion to someone who is still living inside that illusion? How do you communicate the joy of authentic spiritual experience to someone who has never tasted it? The children noticed the changes too, but their response was completely different. Children are naturally more sensitive to authenticity than adults are. They can sense when someone is genuinely present versus just going through the motions. They can feel the difference between real engagement and artificial animation. My kids started seeking me out more often. They wanted to tell me about their day, to share their worries and dreams, to play games and have adventures. They seemed to instinctively understand that something had shifted in my availability to them, even though they couldn't articulate what that something was. I realized that for years, even when I wasn't actively drinking, I had been less present with them because my consciousness was clouded by the effects of alcohol. Even when I was physically there, I wasn't really there. My attention was fragmented, my patience was limited, my ability to connect with their natural joy and wonder was impaired. But as my consciousness cleared, as my spiritual practices deepened my capacity for presence and patience, I was becoming the father I had always wanted to be, but had never quite been able to access. I was more playful, more creative, more emotionally available, more capable of providing the kind of stable, loving presence that children need to thrive. This created a beautiful, positive feedback loop. The more present I became with my children, the more their natural joy and wonder inspired my own spiritual development. The more I engaged with their spontaneous laughter and unconditional love, the more I understood what spiritual teachers mean when they talk about becoming like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. Children live in a natural state of presence. They don't need alcohol to feel joy. They're naturally joyful. They don't need artificial stimulation to be creative. They're naturally creative. They don't need substances to connect with others. They're naturally loving and trusting. Spending time with my children in this new state of consciousness was like taking a masterclass in authentic happiness. But this blessing created new challenges. The more fulfilling my relationships with my children became, the more obvious it was that many of my adult relationships were built on shared dysfunction rather than genuine compatibility. The more comfortable I became with authentic intimacy, the more uncomfortable I became with the artificial intimacy that alcohol had facilitated. Many of my friendships had been based primarily on shared drinking experiences. We would get together to watch sports and drink beer, to go to wine tastings, to meet at bars after work. When I removed alcohol from these relationships, there often wasn't much left. We discovered that we had been using alcohol as a social lubricant because we didn't actually have that much in common without it. This was painful but necessary. I was learning that authentic relationships require shared values, mutual respect, and genuine interest in each other's well-being. Relationships that are primarily based on shared consumption of consciousness, altering substances, aren't actually relationships. They're just shared addictions. Some friends were understanding and supportive of my transformation. They were genuinely happy to see me becoming healthier and more fulfilled, even if they didn't fully understand the spiritual dimensions of what I was experiencing. These friendships deepened and became more meaningful as they adapted to my new way of being. But other friends felt threatened or judged by my changes. They interpreted my choice not to drink as an implicit criticism of their choice to continue drinking. They felt like my presence at social gatherings made them more conscious of their own drinking habits, and that consciousness made them uncomfortable. I learned that when you stop participating in collective delusions, you make those delusions more visible to the people who are still trapped in them. When you refuse to enable dysfunctional patterns, you force other people to confront the dysfunction they would prefer to ignore. When you choose authenticity over social conformity, you challenge other people's compromises between truth and comfort. This doesn't make you better than anyone else, but it does make you different. And that difference can be difficult for relationships that were built on shared dysfunction rather than shared growth. The ripple effects extended beyond my immediate relationships to my work life, my social life, and even my relationship with entertainment and media. I found myself less interested in movies and television shows that glorified drinking culture. I became more sensitive to the constant barrage of alcohol advertising that surrounds us. I started noticing how many social rituals in our culture are built around the consumption of consciousness-altering substances. It was like waking up from a cultural trance and realizing that alcohol marketing is everywhere. Alcohol consumption is normalized in almost every social context, and questioning this is seen as strange or antisocial. I was beginning to understand that we live in a culture that systematically undermines spiritual development while pretending to support individual growth and authentic happiness. But the most profound ripple effect was internal. As my consciousness cleared and my spiritual practices deepened, I began to experience what I can only describe as a fundamental shift in identity. I was no longer a person who struggled with drinking. I was no longer someone who used alcohol to cope with life's challenges. I was no longer seeking transcendence through artificial means. I was becoming someone whose primary source of joy, peace, and fulfillment came from within. Someone whose connection to the divine was strong enough to sustain me through whatever challenges life might bring. Someone whose spiritual practices provided such reliable access to authentic happiness that artificial substitutes had lost their appeal. This wasn't just changing what I did, it was changing who I was. And that transformation was rippling out into every aspect of my existence, touching every relationship, influencing every decision, reshaping every priority. As my spiritual journey deepened, I found myself drawn to study how different religious traditions have understood the relationship between alcohol and spiritual development. What I discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Almost every major spiritual tradition in human history has recognized that there's something about alcohol that's fundamentally incompatible with authentic spiritual growth. This wasn't just arbitrary religious rulemaking. These traditions had developed their understanding through centuries of careful observation of what actually helps people develop spiritually and what hinders that development. They had noticed patterns that our modern culture seems to have forgotten or chosen to ignore. In Buddhism, one of the 5 basic precepts that every practitioner is encouraged to follow is to avoid intoxicants. Not because pleasure is evil or because the Buddha wanted to make life difficult for people, but because intoxication clouds the clarity of mind that's essential for seeing reality as it actually is. Buddhism is fundamentally about waking up from illusion, and alcohol is recognized as something that reinforces illusion rather than dispelling it. I found this particularly meaningful because I had experienced exactly what the Buddhist teachings describe. Alcohol had kept me trapped in delusions about what would make me happy, about what my real problems were, about what solutions would actually work. It had prevented me from seeing clearly the patterns in my life that weren't serving me, the relationships that weren't healthy, the choices that were keeping me stuck. But as my meditation practice developed and my consumption of alcohol decreased, I began to experience what Buddhists call mindfulness. The ability to see my thoughts, emotions, and circumstances clearly without the distortion of wishful thinking or fear-based avoidance. This clarity was uncomfortable at first because it meant facing truths I had been avoiding, but it was also liberating because it meant I could finally address problems rather than just medicating their symptoms. In Hinduism, I discovered texts that described alcohol as an obstacle to the development of what they call sattva, which is roughly translated as purity or harmony. According to these teachings, alcohol increases what they call rajas and tamas, which are qualities of agitation and dullness, respectively. In other words, alcohol either makes you restless and reactive, or it makes you lethargic and unconscious. Neither of these states is conducive to spiritual development. This aligned perfectly with my own experience. When I was drinking heavily, I was either in a state of artificial stimulation and poor decision-making, or I was in a state of numbness and disengagement. I was rarely in the balanced, clear, peaceful state that seemed to be necessary for genuine spiritual insight and growth. The Hindu concept of sattva helped me understand what I was cultivating through my spiritual practices. Meditation, prayer, study of wisdom teachings, service to others, these activities naturally increased the quality of harmony and clarity in my consciousness. They helped me develop what felt like a steady, peaceful, alert state of being that was infinitely more satisfying than the artificial highs and crashes of alcohol consumption. In the mystical traditions of Islam, particularly in Sufism, I found some of the most beautiful poetry about the difference between physical wine and spiritual wine. Sufi poets like Hafez and Saadi wrote extensively about divine intoxication, but they were always careful to distinguish between the wine of the world and the wine of love. The wine of love, according to these poets, was the ecstasy that comes from complete surrender to the divine. It was described as an intoxication that brings clarity rather than confusion, unity rather than separation, wisdom rather than folly. The wine of the world was seen as a pale imitation that actually prevents the experience of true spiritual ecstasy. Reading these Sufi texts, I realized that what I had been seeking through alcohol was actually what the Sufis called divine love. I had been longing for the experience of transcending my ordinary, limited sense of self and feeling connected to something infinite and eternal. But I had been trying to achieve this through means that actually reinforced my sense of separation and limitation. The divine intoxication that the Sufis described wasn't just poetic metaphor. It was a description of an actual experience that becomes available through authentic spiritual practice. As my own practices deepened, I began to taste what they were writing about, moments of such profound love and gratitude and connection to the divine that every artificial substitute seemed not just unnecessary, but almost insulting by comparison. But it was in Christianity that I found the most complex and nuanced understanding of wine as both symbol and substance. In Christian tradition, wine represents the blood of Christ, the promise of eternal life, the ultimate communion between human and divine. But the same tradition also contains clear warnings about the dangers of drunkenness and the spiritual consequences of addiction. The book of Proverbs says, "Wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise." This wasn't condemning wine itself, but warning about the misuse of something that has sacred significance. It was recognizing that the same substance that can symbolize divine communion can also become an obstacle to experiencing that communion authentically. I found this tension fascinating because it reflected my own experience so perfectly. Wine could represent everything I was seeking spiritually, the desire for transcendence, for communion, for connection to something eternal and meaningful. But drinking wine couldn't actually deliver what it symbolized. The symbol was pointing towards something real and available, but consuming the symbol was preventing me from experiencing what it pointed toward. This helped me understand something crucial about the nature of spiritual symbolism. Symbols are meant to direct our attention towards spiritual realities, not to substitute for those realities. When we mistake the symbol for what it symbolizes, we miss the point entirely. When we try to achieve spiritual experience by consuming spiritual symbols, we're like people trying to quench their thirst by eating pictures of water. But perhaps the most profound insight came from studying the Gnostic traditions, particularly their understanding of what they called the wine of this world versus the wine of the pleroma, which was their term for the spiritual realm. According to Gnostic teachings, the wine of this world represents attachment to material pleasures that keep the soul trapped in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. The wine of the pleroma, on the other hand, represents the kind of spiritual fulfillment that frees the soul from dependence on material satisfaction. It represents the discovery that our deepest needs can only be met through connection to our spiritual source, not through consumption of physical substances. This Gnostic perspective helped me understand why my transformation had felt so much like waking up from a dream. I had been living in what they would call the world of illusion, seeking real satisfaction through means that could only provide temporary distraction from the fact that real satisfaction was missing from my life. But as I developed authentic spiritual practices, I was gaining access to what they called gnosis, which is direct spiritual knowledge or experience. I was learning firsthand that the peace, joy, and fulfillment I had been seeking were real and available, but only through means that actually connected me to my spiritual source rather than disconnecting me from it. Studying these various traditions wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was validation of what I was experiencing in my own spiritual development. These traditions, developed in different times and places by people who had never met each other, all came to remarkably similar conclusions about the relationship between consciousness-altering substances and spiritual growth. They all recognize that human beings have a natural longing for transcendence, for connection to something greater than their ordinary experience of life. They all understood that this longing is sacred and legitimate and should be honored. But they all also recognized that there are authentic ways to fulfill this longing and counterfeit ways. And they all identified alcohol as belonging to the counterfeit category. What struck me most powerfully was that none of these traditions were trying to deny or suppress the human longing for transcendence. They were all trying to show people how to fulfill that longing authentically. They weren't saying that the desire for spiritual experience was wrong. They were saying that alcohol was the wrong way to satisfy that desire. This gave me a completely different framework for understanding my own journey. I wasn't overcoming a weakness or defeating an enemy. I was learning to satisfy my deepest spiritual longings through means that actually worked, rather than means that only pretended to work. I was discovering that every major wisdom tradition in human history had been trying to tell people what I was learning through my own experience. The peace you're seeking is real. The joy you're longing for is available. The transcendence you're craving is your birthright. But you have to seek these things where they can actually be found, not where they're counterfeited. The sacred scriptures weren't trying to make life harder for people. They were trying to show people the path to the authentic fulfillment that makes artificial substitutes unnecessary. They weren't trying to take away pleasure. They were trying to point toward a pleasure so profound that temporary pleasures lose their compelling power. I was beginning to understand that what I had been calling my recovery was actually my return to the spiritual path that these traditions had been mapping out for thousands of years. I wasn't inventing a new way of living. I was rediscovering an ancient way of living that had been tested and refined by countless people over countless generations. And the more I studied these traditions, the more grateful I became for the wisdom they offered, and the more confident I became that the path I was walking was not only possible, but inevitable for anyone who sincerely seeks authentic spiritual fulfillment. A year later, I found myself back in that same grocery store, walking past that same wine aisle where my transformation had crystallized so clearly. But this time, I wasn't stopping to observe or reflect. I was simply walking past, the way you might walk past a store that sells something you no longer need or want. That moment felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with my discovery of what the word alcohol actually means. I had started this journey learning that alcohol means spirit, and I was ending it by returning to my own spirit. I had begun by seeking the sacred through substances, and I was concluding by finding the sacred through authentic spiritual practice. The irony was so profound it took my breath away. All along, every time I had reached for alcohol, I had been reaching for spirit. Every time I had consumed alcohol, I had been trying to consume spirit. Every time I had sought transcendence through drinking, I had been seeking to transcend through connecting with spirit. But the cruel deception was that consuming alcohol actually separated me from spirit. Seeking spirit through alcohol was like trying to find water by drinking sand. The thirst was real, the need was legitimate, the longing was sacred, but the means I was using to satisfy that longing was creating more thirst, more need, more longing. Now, walking through that store, I was someone who had found what he had been seeking all along. I had discovered that my own spirit, my connection to the divine, my access to transcendence and peace and joy were available to me at every moment. I didn't need to consume anything to access them. I didn't need to purchase anything to experience them. I didn't need to wait for anything to enjoy them. This wasn't the end of challenges in my life. I still faced difficulties, disappointments, losses, and struggles, but I faced them from a completely different foundation. Instead of trying to escape from challenging experiences, I had learned to find the divine within them. Instead of trying to medicate difficult emotions, I had developed the spiritual resources to meet them with grace and wisdom. My marriage had eventually found a new equilibrium. My wife had come to appreciate the changes in me, even if she didn't fully understand the spiritual framework that had created those changes. She could see that I was more present, more patient, more genuinely loving. She could feel that our relationship had become more intimate and authentic as I had become more intimate and authentic with myself. My children had flourished in ways that amazed me. Having a father who was fully present, emotionally available and spiritually grounded had given them a security and confidence that I could see rippling out into every area of their lives. They were more creative, more joyful, more resilient, more trusting. They were growing up with an example of what it looks like to live from spiritual principles rather than just talking about them. My work had become more meaningful as I approached it from a place of service rather than just personal ambition. My friendships had become deeper as they were based on authentic connection rather than shared dysfunction. My entire life had been restructured around what actually mattered rather than what I had been told should matter. But the most profound change was internal. I had discovered that everything I had been seeking outside myself had been available inside myself all along. The peace I had been trying to find through alcohol was the natural state of my spirit when it wasn't being clouded by substances. The joy I had been trying to manufacture through intoxication was my birthright as a child of the divine. The transcendence I had been trying to achieve through drinking was available through prayer, meditation, and authentic spiritual practice. I had learned that the sacred thirst that had driven me to alcohol was actually the most reliable compass I could have for finding authentic spiritual fulfillment. Instead of seeing this thirst as a problem to be solved, I had learned to see it as guidance to be followed. Instead of trying to quench it with substitutes, I had learned to let it lead me to the source of living water that could actually satisfy it. The spiritual practices that had once felt foreign and difficult had become the most natural and essential parts of my day. Meditation wasn't something I had to force myself to do. It was something I looked forward to because it connected me to the source of everything good in my life. Prayer wasn't a chore or obligation. It was a conversation with the divine presence that I had learned to recognize in every moment. Reading spiritual texts wasn't an academic exercise. It was communion with the wisdom of people who had walked this path before me and wanted to share what they had discovered. Service to others wasn't a duty. It was a joy, because I had learned that we're all connected, that helping others heal their relationship with spirit actually strengthened my own connection to the divine. I had become what some traditions call a twice-born person, someone who had died to an old way of being and been reborn into a new way of living. Someone who had been lost and been found, who had been asleep and had awakened, who had been separated from their source and had remembered their true identity. This transformation hadn't happened through willpower or self-discipline, though those qualities had played a role. It had happened through grace, through the mysterious process by which authentic spiritual seeking inevitably leads to authentic spiritual finding. It had happened through what some people call surrender, the willingness to let go of what you think you want in order to receive what you actually need. Looking back now, I can see that my relationship with alcohol had been a spiritual crisis disguised as a personal problem. I had been seeking God through means that actually separated me from God. I had been trying to satisfy sacred hunger through profane consumption. I had been attempting to fulfill eternal longings through temporary pleasures. But the crisis had been necessary because it had forced me to face the fundamental questions that I might never have confronted otherwise. What was I really seeking? What did I actually need? Where could authentic fulfillment be found? What would make my life genuinely meaningful? These questions had led me back to the source of everything I had been seeking all along. They had led me back to spirit. Not spirit in a bottle, but the spirit that I am. Not spirit as a substance to be consumed, but spirit as the essence of who I am when I'm not clouded by illusion or distracted by artificial satisfactions. I had learned that the word alcohol means spirit, not because alcohol contains spirit, but because it represents humanity's perennial confusion between the symbol and what it symbolizes. Alcohol represents our longing for spirit, but consuming alcohol actually prevents us from experiencing the spirit we're longing for. The real spirit, the authentic spirit, the spirit that actually satisfies our deepest thirst, is not something we can drink. It's something we are. It's not something we can purchase. It's something we can remember. It's not something we can consume. It's something we can become. This understanding had changed everything about how I approached life. Instead of seeking happiness through acquisition or consumption, I had learned to find happiness through recognition of what was already present. Instead of trying to feel better by adding something to my experience, I had learned to feel better by removing the obstacles to recognizing the goodness that was already there. Instead of trying to find God through substances or experiences or achievements, I had learned to find God through the simple practice of being present to what is actually happening in each moment with an open heart and a clear mind. Walking out of that grocery store, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey I had been on. The pain had been real, the confusion had been genuine, the struggle had been intense. But it had all been worth it because it had led me back to the truth of who I am and why I'm here. I was no longer someone who struggled with alcohol. I was someone who had found what alcohol had promised but never delivered. I was someone who had discovered that the spirit I had been seeking in bottles was actually the spirit I am when I'm not separated from my source by artificial substitutions. I was someone who had learned that the most intoxicating experience available to human beings is the experience of remembering who we really are and why we're really here. That experience doesn't wear off, doesn't create hangovers, doesn't lead to addiction or dependency. It leads to freedom, the freedom to be authentically yourself, the freedom to love without condition, the freedom to serve without expectation, the freedom to find joy in simple moments and peace in difficult circumstances. It leads to the discovery that everything you've been seeking has been seeking you too. And the reason you couldn't find it through artificial means is that it was waiting for you to seek it through authentic means. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, know this: what you're seeking is real. The peace you're longing for exists. The joy you're craving is available. The transcendence you're desperate for is your birthright. But it can't be found in a bottle. It can only be found in the spirit that you are when you remember who you really are and return to the source of everything you've been seeking. The journey back to spirit is the most important journey you'll ever take, and it begins the moment you realize that what you're seeking was never actually lost. It was just waiting for you to stop looking for it in all the wrong places and start looking for it where it can actually be found, in your own heart, in your own soul, in your own connection to the divine that has been there all along, waiting patiently for you to come home.